Thank you, Kathleen. Let's look at an example of how to calculate the ounce equivalents based on the creditable grains. So in our example, we know from the manufacturer that our 5 mini pancakes contain 30 grams of creditable grains. We then use Exhibit A and determine that pancakes fall into Group C. So we divide the 30 grams of creditable grains by 16 to get 1.875 ounce equivalents. Because we always round down to the nearest quarter ounce equivalent, our answer becomes 1.75 ounce equivalents. So now that we've determined that our grain product meets the required ounce equivalents, we need to make sure it also meets at least one of the criteria listed on the slide. An easy thing to look for is a whole grain as the first ingredient, and if water is the first ingredient, then the second ingredient must be a whole grain. In mixed dishes, such as pizza or a corn dog, a whole grain must be listed as the first grain ingredient. Products that contain at least 8 grams of whole grain per serving will sometimes have a whole grain stamp, which we will show you in a moment. Also, FDA's health claim for whole grain foods on the product label also signifies a whole grain rich product. Again, a valid CN or child nutrition label listing the ounce equivalents of grains verifies that your product credits as whole grain rich. And finally, if information is unclear to you, you will want to ask the manufacturer for further documentation verifying that the total weight of whole grain ingredients exceeds that of the non-whole grain ingredients. USDA has a standard form that's in the back of the whole grain resource, and most manufacturers can very quickly and easily email this form to you upon request that you can keep with your records to document. Okay, so now we're going to walk through some examples together. In this example, which is white whole wheat breadsticks, you can see from the ingredients that whole wheat flour is the first ingredient, and the remaining flour is enriched, which meets our whole grain rich criteria. These breadsticks also contain oat fiber, which is circled in red. Remember, oat fiber is one of those non-creditable grains that Kathleen mentioned earlier. But we can also see from reading the label that this product contains less than 2% of this ingredient, which is acceptable. If oat fiber were present in an amount higher than 2%, this product would not be creditable in the school meal program. Our next example is a chicken corn dog, and this label is nice because it separates the grain portion from the meat portion of the product. You'll see under the batter ingredients that water is the first ingredient. So remember, when water is the first ingredient, the next ingredient must be a whole grain. And in this case, our next 2 ingredients are whole grain wheat flour and whole grain corn. These are the only 2 grain ingredients, and both are whole grains, so this product is creditable as whole grain rich. Like other grains, in order for a ready-to-eat cereal to be considered whole grain rich, it must list a whole grain as the first or primary ingredient, and in addition, the cereal must be fortified with vitamins and minerals. But if a ready-to-eat cereal is made entirely from 100% whole grains, it is not required to be fortified. More information on ready-to-eat cereals is available in the whole grain resource and in page 4. This is an example of the whole grain stamp. In order for an item to have the stamp on its package, it must contain at least 8 grams of fiber. The 100% stamp, the other version of the stamp that indicates a product has 16 grams or more of whole grains, appears similar but with slightly different language. Manufacturers are not required to put the whole grain stamp on products, so just because it is not there doesn't mean a product isn't whole grain rich. Also, you still will need to ensure that the remainder of the grains or flours in the product are enriched in order for it to be creditable. This slide shows the language of FDA's health claim on whole grains, which again may appear on the package of whole grain rich items. This health claim is not required to be on a label, so as with the stamp, just because it is not there doesn't mean that the item doesn't meet the whole grain rich criteria. However, it is something that you can look for as an indicator that the product is whole grain rich. As you know, you must offer at least the daily minimum servings of grains for each age grade grouping, which is indicated in parentheses in the meal pattern chart we showed earlier. So how do we determine that number? To determine the minimum, you look at the meal each day that offers the least ounce equivalents of grains and make sure that this meets the daily minimum requirement. For example, we know from our meal pattern chart that students in grades 9 through 12 must be offered a minimum of 2 ounce equivalents of grains at lunch. If on Monday we offer a hamburger on a whole grain roll that has 2 ounce equivalents and a turkey wrap that has 1 1/4 ounce equivalents, would we be reaching the daily minimum requirements? The answer here would be no, because we use the meal that offers the least ounce equivalents as our daily minimum. The menu item that offers the least is the turkey wrap with 1 1/4 ounce equivalents, which does not meet our daily minimum requirement of 2. This slide is showing a sample menu for grades 6 through 8. The daily minimum for this age group is 1 ounce equivalent daily. We want to check to see if we are meeting both daily and weekly grain requirements with our menu. So first, we will go across each day to determine our daily minimum that is being offered, which is then listed in the right-hand column. Remember, we select the meal offered each day with the least ounce equivalents offered to determine our daily minimum. As we look at each day, we see that we have offered at least 1 ounce equivalent every day, so we know we have met our daily minimum. Next, we will add up our daily minimums to determine whether we've met our weekly minimum requirement, which is 8 ounce equivalents for this grade grouping. We've offered a total of 8 1/4 ounce equivalents for grains for our 6th through 8th graders for this week, so we have met our weekly grains minimum as well. So let's look at a question that we have been asked. Does the breading on meat or meat alternates count toward the grain requirement? The answer is yes, if the breading meets the whole grain rich criteria and also meets the minimum creditable amount per serving. And for breading, which falls in group B, that would have to be at least 1/4 ounce equivalent. So in this case, the breading would credit toward the grains component. Now, because next school year, all grains must be whole grain rich to be creditable, the question has come up regarding whether a breaded chicken patty made from non-whole grain rich grains can be offered with the reimbursable meal, with the breading considered an extra, as long as dietary specifications are met for the week. The answer is yes. If the breading does not meet the whole grain rich criteria, the breading would count as an extra food, and all dietary specifications must still be met for the week for calories, saturated fat, trans fat, and sodium. Doing this is not recommended for a few reasons. First of all, it can be very costly to purchase items that do not credit toward the meal pattern and also at the same time still meet the minimum daily requirements with creditable items. Also, serving large quantities of extra items can make meal planning and compliance with the dietary specifications more difficult. Also, it is important to check your ingredients for those non-creditable grains we mentioned earlier. If, for example, the breading on a chicken patty contains more than 2% by weight of those non-creditable grains, then the entire chicken patty is not creditable in the meal pattern according to USDA. This slide shows adjustments made based on the length of the school week for facilities that do not operate on the standard 5-day week. Again, the meal pattern chart on pairs has been adjusted for the 7-day week. For a shorter week, you would decrease the weekly quantity of grains by 20% for each day less than 5 days. And for a longer week, you would increase the weekly quantity of grains by 20% for each day greater than 5. For additional information, you can refer to Form PDE 702A on PAIR's download form. This slide is just showing an example for grades K through 5, showing the calculated weekly grain requirements for a variety of different length standard weeks. Okay, now that we've discussed grains and the whole grain rich requirements for next school year, we are going to move on to the meat alternate component at lunch. Here is our meal pattern chart showing weekly and daily minimum requirements for meat and meat alternates. As with the grains component, the meat alternate component originally had both weekly minimums and maximums for each grade grouping. So you will still see those ranges listed on some of USDA's meal pattern charts. However, again, USDA has extended flexibility and made it permanent. So as Kathleen mentioned earlier with the grains, the maximums are listed only for the meal planner's guidance at this point. Like with all other components, a variety is always encouraged. Because of the fat specifications and the Target 1 sodium guidelines starting on July 1st, limiting meats that are fried, higher fat, or processed is encouraged. Items such as lean meats and poultry, eggs, fish, low-fat cheese and yogurt, legumes, and nuts and seeds are other healthy options. Beans can also be offered and can include things like black beans, garbanzo beans, lentils, and split peas. The Dietary Guidelines for Americans encourages plant-based sources of proteins. Therefore, tofu and soy yogurt are recognized as meat alternate options, which are great for diversifying options available to populations such as vegetarians and other culturally diverse groups. For information on crediting tofu and soy yogurt as meat alternates, you can refer to USDA's memo SP 16-2012, which is located on PAIR's Form Download under Nutrition Standards and School Meals, Form PDE 707. Just to do a quick overview, when planning to offer tofu and soy products as meat alternates, 2.2 ounces or 1/4 cup of commercially prepared tofu containing at least 5 grams of protein is creditable as 1 ounce equivalent of a meat alternate. A 1/2 cup serving of soy yogurt is creditable as 1 ounce equivalent of a meat alternate. Remember that food items should be easily recognizable as part of a food group that contributes to a healthy meal. So using tofu in a way that is not recognizable, for example, blended in a soup, does not credit as a meat alternate unless another recognizable meat or meat alternate is also present in the item. So for example, if the blended soup with tofu contained diced chicken pieces, then both the tofu and chicken would credit toward the meat alternate component. The last component of lunch that we will discuss today is fluid milk. Here you have the snapshot of the fluid milk requirement portion of our meal pattern chart. Fluid milk requirements are the same across all the age grade groups from kindergarten all the way through high school. When offering milk, as you know, schools must offer a variety or at least 2 different options of those listed on the slide. Just to review, only fat-free milk may be flavored or unflavored. Low-fat milk must be unflavored. Whole milk, 2%, and low-fat flavored milks are not allowable in the school meals. Milk substitutes that are optional for school meal providers to offer in place of fluid milk for special dietary needs must meet USDA's nutrient requirements, but those products do not have fat or flavor restrictions. Okay, now that we have completed going through our review of lunch, we will now discuss the required components and updated meal pattern regulations for breakfast. As you know, 3 components must be offered for school breakfast. Those components are fruit or optional vegetable, grains, and fluid milk. Servings and nutrient standards are based on the same age grade groups as for lunch. Fruit and fluid milk requirements are actually the same across all age grade groups. Grain minimums, however, vary among the grade groups. There is an overlap, though, for breakfast, so a single breakfast menu could be used for all grades if desired by the menu planner. As we will review on our upcoming slides, for school year 2014-15, all grains served at breakfast must be whole grain rich, and Target 1 for sodium specifications go into effect. Additionally, students must now select fruit for a reimbursable breakfast under offer versus serve, which we will discuss further on the next slide. Beginning school year 2014-15, a full 1 cup serving of fruit must be offered at breakfast. This is the new minimum required amount of fruit at breakfast for all age grade groups. Under offer versus serve, students must select 1/2 cup of fruit for a reimbursable breakfast meal. This is meant to encourage the consumption of fruits without disregarding the concern for plate waste. Although vegetables are not required at breakfast, menu planners have the option of substituting some vegetables in place of fruit at breakfast. It is required that the first 2 cups of vegetables per week that are substituted for fruit at breakfast must come from the red, orange, dark green, beans, peas, or other vegetable subgroups, and not from the starchy vegetable group. Pasteurized full-strength fruit and vegetable juice can also be offered as a substitution and credited to meet no more than 1/2 of the fruit components offered over the week. This is the same as we reviewed earlier in the presentation when we discussed juice offered at lunch. All grades must be offered at least 1 ounce equivalent of grains daily. However, the weekly minimum requirement does vary depending on the grade group as shown on the slide. If the school's week differs from the typical 5 days, the minimum grains requirement is adjusted as we discussed earlier. And again, you will find that on the meal pattern chart. And as with lunch, all grains must be whole grain rich starting school year 2014-15. The regulations for milk as a breakfast component are the same as they are for lunch. Again, you have to offer a variety, or at least 2 of the options listed on the slide. And I won't review the rest because we just went over those at lunch, but it is the same. Unlike the National School Lunch Program, the school breakfast program meal pattern does not require a meat alternate component. Schools that wish to offer meats or meat alternates at breakfast have the flexibility to offer a meat alternate in place of some grains, provided they first meet the 1 ounce equivalent of grains that needs to be offered daily. So for the first option, when offering meat or meat alternates at breakfast, the daily grain requirement, 1 ounce equivalent, must first be offered to students. Then any meat or meat alternate offered can credit toward the weekly grains requirement. Under the second option, the meat or meat alternate can be offered as an extra in the meal. Keep in mind that it still must be counted toward the weekly dietary specifications, and this can make meeting those dietary specifications challenging. This optional substitution is intended to allow menu planning flexibility while promoting the consumption of whole grain foods consistent with the recommendations of the Dietary Guidelines for Americans. So let's look at an example using 6th to 8th grade students. It is required that this grade group is offered 8 ounce equivalents of grains each week. The menu planner has opted to offer some meat alternates to meet part of the grains component at breakfast. So first, the school offers 1 ounce equivalent of grains every day in order to meet the daily grain requirement. And then the school also offers 1 ounce equivalent of a meat alternate 3 days per week. So the 5 ounce equivalents from the grains plus the 3 ounce equivalents from the meat alternates added together does meet the required amount for 1 week for 6th to 8th grade students, which is 8 ounce equivalents. This slide demonstrates how the same breakfast menu can be used for all age grade groups if desired by the menu planner. This could be accomplished by offering 1 cup of fruit, 1 ounce equivalent of grains daily, and 9 ounce equivalents total for the weekly grain minimum, 1 cup of milk, and an average calorie range of 450 to 500 calories per week. Or per day, I'm sorry, averaged over the week. So let's do a quick review of offer versus serve at breakfast. Offer versus serve is optional for all grades, and the 3 required meal components, milk, fruit, and grains, must be offered. At least 4 food items within the 3 components must be offered for offer versus serve, and students are required to select at least 3 food items for a reimbursable breakfast. In addition to the new 1-cup fruit serving requirement being implemented for school year 14-15, under Offer versus Serve, it is now required that students take 1/2 cup of fruit in order to have a reimbursable meal, breakfast meal, under Offer versus Serve. Okay, so the last portion of our presentation will address the nutrient requirements. We'll discuss calories, saturated and trans fat, and sodium as they relate both to breakfast and lunch. Calories, saturated fat, and sodium specifications are the daily amounts based on the weighted average for a full week of meals. The only change in the nutrient specifications for the upcoming school year are for sodium. Schools must meet, on average over the school week, the minimum and maximum calorie levels specified on the meal pattern chart. Saturated fat must comprise less than 10% of total calories averaged over the week. Of course, Target 1 sodium levels are now in effect for both breakfast and lunch, and they do vary by age grade grouping. Target 1 sodium levels will remain in effect for 3 years before the next sodium target is planned to be implemented. And finally, food products and ingredients used to prepare school meals must contain 0 grams of trans fat, which is less than 0.5 grams per serving. Foods that contain a minimal amount of naturally occurring trans fats are allowable in the school meal program, and these are found in some beef, lamb, and dairy products. Target 1 sodium levels, as we've said several times, do go into effect this school year, and this will be the first of 3 planned changes, the last of which go into effect school year 2022 to 2023. Most schools have been preparing for this upcoming change by reducing sodium gradually. According to the American Heart Association, children are consuming salt in amounts that far exceed the recommended daily limits for sodium. As we have seen with overweight and obesity, the proportion of children and adolescents with pre-hypertension has risen over the last 2 decades. Lowering the intake of sodium in our meals is associated with health benefits, including reducing high blood pressure, which has numerous heart-protecting effects. Progressively reducing sodium content is also important because children's salt preference is influenced by the food choices they have. Their preference for saltier foods may be reduced if they are exposed to lower sodium options, and gradually reducing sodium in school meals can make the change less noticeable. This is a chart showing the Target 1 sodium limits, and they're shown in bold in the left column. Again, beyond school year 14-15, the only additional requirements that will be going into effect for the weekly average sodium limit in the school meal patterns are Target 2, starting school year 2017-18, and the final target in school year 2022-23. As you may have heard previously, prior to the implementation of Target 2 and the final sodium targets, USDA will evaluate relevant data on sodium intake in human health and may make adjustments based on the latest scientific research. So stay tuned for that. This slide shows some of the commonly used sources of sodium. For your reference, you can see that 1 teaspoon of table salt equals about 2,300 milligrams of sodium. So some things you can look for are ingredients that have the word sodium in them, such as monosodium glutamate, disodium phosphate, also some preservatives like sodium nitrate or nitrite that are in like hot dogs and lunch meats are big sources. Even baking soda and baking powder contain sodium as well. Also, canned vegetables, soups are common sources of sodium. Some condiments tend to be high in sodium, like soy sauce, salad dressing, and ketchup. And there are some foods that just naturally have sodium in them, like cheese. So some tips for reducing sodium in school meals would really be to read those nutrition facts labels and compare the sodium content for similar foods and try and select ones that have the lower sodium content that your students will still accept. Also check with manufacturers and your vendors for lower sodium food options. serve more fresh fruits and vegetables and fresh foods in general, and fewer processed ones. And you also can look for lower sodium canned options as well, including some of the USDA foods. You can modify recipes that use high sodium ingredients, things like cheese sauce, spaghetti sauce, and canned soups, of course, again, are those things that are high in sodium. Look for lower sodium versions of favorite condiments like lower sodium ketchup or salad dressings, and then remove or reduce salt from recipes made in-house. And in place of that, you can use fresh herbs or also dried herbs and spices to flavor the food rather than having to use so much salt. Sometimes people ask about using salt substitutes that are on the market. Those contain potassium chloride, and those can be harmful for some people, and they are not appropriate for use in schools. Thank you all for your time and attention. I'm going to turn this back over to Elaine, and we'll begin answering questions. And if questions arise where we're unsure of the answer or we're awaiting additional guidance from USDA, we will address those in an upcoming questions and answers document. Thank you.